Solomon is among the most emblematic kings in history, one of the most prosperous rulers of all time, and one of the richest men the world has ever seen. In the Bible, he was prominent, not only for being the successor of his father, King David, on the throne of Israel, but also for his unusual wisdom and his extraordinary works. The main one being the first temple of Jerusalem. For you to get an idea, although Solomon is not mentioned in the biblical text until David's last days are recorded, after that, his name appears about 300 times only in the Old Testament and at least 12 times in the New Testament. However, Solomon's name is also quoted in other non-biblical writings and is involved in Jewish legends that even relate it to a series of mystical and even obscure practices, such as a supposed control of demons. But in this video, you will know Solomon's true story, according to the Bible. King Solomon was the son of David Bathsheba, one who had been a woman from Uriah. Therefore, Solomon was born when David reigned from Jerusalem. He is also called in the Bible by the name Jediah, which means loved by the Lord. King Solomon ruled over Israel for about 40 years, approximately between 971 and 931 BC. There is virtually no information about the early years of Solomon's life and youth. But, considering the biblical information about David's family life, we can establish a parameter on the type of environment in which Solomon grew up. We know that David had several women, and this obviously resulted in many problems between their wives and their children, who starred in the most varied intrigue, usually in search of prestige and power. Even Solomon himself appears in biblical history in a context of great tension in the royal family, in the midst of a struggle for the throne of Israel, since King David was old and weakened. But before that, Absalom, who was half-brother from Solomon, he had already tried to usurp his father's throne, but was unsuccessful. But sometime later, the oldest of David's surviving children, named Adonias, tried to repeat the same movement as Absalom, self-proclaiming king over Israel. Adonias even got the support of Joab, former general of David, and the priest Abiathar, and tried in every way to occupy his father's throne, even making a coronation festivity. So when they learned of Adonijah's plan, Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan, the priest Asaph, and other allies, they tried to work so that David remembered the promise not yet fulfilled about Solomon, that he would be his successor. Thus David gave orders about Solomon's rise to the throne, and he was crowned King Israel, being anointed by Zadok. Probably, when he was crowned, King Solomon was no more than 18 years old. Solomon's reign was long, reaching 4 decades of government. But scholars discuss whether their period reign was approximately between 971 and 931 BC or between 960 and 920 BC, the first possibility being the most likely. Shortly after David's death, King Solomon followed his father's instructions and actually acted to solidify his position as king and dismantle any opposition. Thus he tried to order Adonijah's deaths and Job and the banishment of Abiathar, and then reign without internal opposition. King Solomon inherited from David an extensive territory with approximately 128,000 square kilometers. During his reign, Solomon greatly improved Israel's domestic conditions. He replaced the old tribal divisions with a division of his territory into 12 administrative districts, which each had an officer commissioned by the king. These districts were responsible for providing livelihoods to cut during the year, and each district responsible for a month's supply. The list of daily groceries was very costly, and according to the record of the first book of Kings, chapter 4, included 9,000 pounds of flour, including noble flour and ordinary flour, 30 oxen, between barrels and raised in ordinary pasture, 100 sheep, as well as deer, gazelles, horses, and poultry treated, which served as table delicacies. And many people think this amount is fanciful. However, these people forget that these foods were intended for the entire court of Israel at their height, which probably included all employees, officers, and families, extended family. Many scholars believe that this amount probably fed more than 12,000 people every day. King Solomon's court was quite complete and organized, and his government assistants were called princes. And in the military, King Solomon also made significant improvements. He introduced battle and cavalry cars into his army, also provided new roads, and established border fortresses to store the routes of commerce. Even speaking of commerce, Commercial activity was the strong point of the reign of him, controlled trade routes, and organized strategic points of action that earned him a lot of revenue, so that silver became as common in his kingdom as stone and the stone cedar, causing him to live in the midst of a splendor of wealth never seen before in Israel. In addition, he was a great diplomat, and throughout his reign, rarely Israel had to worry about some foreign military threat. Solomon's first significant trade agreement was with Iran, king of Tyre, in which he annually paid something equivalent to 2,000 tons of wheat and 400,000 liters of pure olive oil in exchange for woods and marblers for their buildings. King Solomon also signed a contract with Egyptian traders for the horses and cars trade and, in turn, exported them to Ethiopia and Syrians, of course, obtaining a good profit. And the commercial performance that brought more profit for King Solomon was his maritime trade, where his boats sailed through the Red Sea and the Arabic Sea in the Indian Ocean, reaching Ufari, and these trips could last up to 3 years. When considered annual revenue from their commercial strategies, the rates it received for the traffic of goods, and the taxes paid by the population present throughout the territory they controlled, the estimate of the sum of wealth reaches an exceptional level, placing the King Solomon as one of the richer men in all the history of mankind. Of all the constructions made during the reign of King Solomon, the temple in Jerusalem was certainly the most important of them. According to God himself, King Solomon executed his father's project to build a temple to house the covenant ark. And to obtain the necessary labor, King Solomon resorted to forced labor, especially from Canaanite peoples subjugated by Israel. However, the number of Canaanites workers was insufficient to supply his plans, so he recruited Israelites for this task, also forcing them to a kind of forced work. Obviously, this measure was quite unpopular, a fact that was evidenced in the episode of Adonan's death, the superintendent of workers' groups. The temple built by Solomon was located on Mount Moriah, where King David had built an altar to the Lord. And before that, probably where Abraham would have climbed with Isaac to sacrifice him. But although David collected materials for the construction of the temple, it was only in the 4th year of the reign of Solomon that it began to be built. And even looking like a modest dimensional construction for current standards, the temple building represented a large venture at the time, built with the most valuable, with tons of gold and noble woods. When he completed the construction of the temple in the 11th year of his reign, Solomon, he planned a great celebration, where many sacrifices were offered in the dedication of the building. And among the other buildings built by King Solomon in Israel, we can highlight the house of the forest of Lebanon, which was 50 meters long, 25 meters wide, and 15 meters high. A portico of columns measuring 25 by 15 meters. A room for his throne where he performed the trials. A house for the daughter of Pharaoh of Egypt, who was one of his wives, whose place had the impressive grandeur in Solomon's own recite. In addition, Solomon also built Milo, a huge fortress to protect the temple. As we know, beyond wealth, King Solomon became known for his wisdom. In the Bible, we read the registration of the dream that King Solomon had, where the Lord appeared to him and asked him what he most wanted to receive. Solomon could have asked riches, longevity, or honor. However, the young king asked for wisdom. He has asked for understanding heart to prudently rule his people. And one of the biblical episodes that most highlights the wisdom of King Solomon is one in which 2 mothers attended his presence vying for a single newborn. The case was quite difficult, as there was no witness. But with great wisdom, King Solomon proposed that the boy be divided into 2 parts to solve the problem. And in the face of the possibility of the death of her son, the true mother preferred to hand the boy to the woman, and this made Solomon judge that cause impeccably. King Solomon's wisdom can also be perceived in all the literature he has produced. Solomon composed thousands of proverbs and songs, and the depth of his proverbs also impresses, so that the Bible reports that he has discussed the trees, animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. Beyond Bible reports, many legends and antiquity documents refer to Solomon's spectacular wisdom. And among the books of the Bible, Solomon is attributed to the authorship of a large part of the book of Proverbs, as well as Ecclesiastes, perhaps the songbook of Solomon's songs, and at least from Psalm 72 and 127. The Bible also says that Solomon's wisdom impressed in such a way that people from all peoples and all kings of the earth came to hear from their wisdom. And one of these visits was made by the Queen of Sabbath, who came from the ends of the earth to personally hear the wisdom of King Solomon. The Queen of Sabbath asked Solomon many questions and puzzles, and the king answered intelligently to all the questions asked by her, leaving her completely impressed. At the time, the Queen of Sabbath presented Solomon with many gifts, besides more than 4 tons of gold. Despite all the wisdom he had, King Solomon took attitudes that brought him big problems. For example, Solomon subjected the people to forced labor. Their international commercial practices somehow made idolatry enter the midst of Israel by contact with other peoples. He applied a heavy tax burden that overwhelmed the Israelites. And there was also his intense polygamy, which was the main means by which false gods began to be recognized in Hebrew territory. Even Solomon himself was influenced by his many foreign wives, and in his old age, practiced a mixed worship, following other gods. And speaking in Solomon's marital life, it seems that marriage was part of its political movements. In other words, it seems that Solomon used his marriages to be able to firm advantageous international agreements. Although it is also true that the biblical text records that Solomon loved his women, indicating that his relationships were not just for strategic advantages. As for Solomon reached the impressive number of 700 wives, plus 300 concubines. He was the Israeli ruler who most despised the biblical ordinance that a king in Israel should not have many women, so that his heart would not deviate from the Lord. Among the wives of King Solomon was the daughter of Pharaoh of Egypt, and on the occasion of this union, Solomon received as a dowry the city of Gezer. Some Arab, Jewish, and Ethiopian traditions suggest that Solomon would also have had a loving relationship with the Queen of Sabbath, which a son was supposedly born, the founder of the Ethiopian royal house. But the Bible reports nothing about this. The heir to Solomon, Reuben, was born from his marriage to Nahama, an Ammonite woman. And considering the period of the reign of Solomon, 40, and the age of his son Reuben when he succeeded, therefore, many scholars believe that Naamah may have been Solomon's first wife. But King Solomon's grave sin by facing worship of God in Israel, when other gods began to follow to satisfy their foreign wives, it could not be unpunished. The Bible says God was outraged by Solomon. The truth is that the king, best known for his wisdom and unimaginable riches, also experienced decay and consequent divine disapproval, because, ironically, he was not wise with the things of God and despised his ordinances. But in his mercy and love of David, God suspended his total judgment during Solomon's life period and did not shut his kingdom. However, even with the postponement of divine judgment during his life, Solomon experienced the threats of enemies that were raised by God to be instruments of judgment in his kingdom, such as Hadad, Edomita, Hezem, Arameus, and Jeroboam. Among these 3 opponents, Jeroboam is the most prominent in the biblical text. He was a strong, hard-working leader who rebelled against King Solomon's policies, and during Rehoboam's reign he divided the kingdom of Israel and became the king of the northern tribes. Therefore, after Solomon's death, divine punishment was actually shed over his house, and the glorious unified kingdom of Israel was taken from his son. The Bible does not bring details about how Solomon's death went. What is known is that he ended his life in a melancholy way, leaving a worn kingdom and about to crumble. But undoubtedly, he made very important contributions to Israel. Solomon was the king who built the temple of the Lord, was the king who consolidated Israel on the international scene of his day, and was the main exponent of Hebrew literature. Already on the many extra-biblical stories about Solomon, there is no evidence that they are true. Yes, in fact, the Bible itself mentions the existence of records about Solomon. Including some of these records, as the titled book of Solomon's history, they served as sources for the biblical writer of the First Kings books and Second Kings. However, these materials were lost. That is, they no longer exist. What currently remains is only fantasy legends and writings, produced mainly by supporters of a more mystical branch of later Judaism. In these legends, Solomon is often portrayed as someone involved with magic, capable of controlling demons, and even talking to animals. But these reports are usually based on science-bigraph writings of unknown authorship that were probably produced in the medieval period. Unfortunately, many people without knowledge prefer to believe in the veracity of these false works and reject what is actually recorded in the biblical text, which, whether or not, is the best documented work in history. Even it is common for some people to say that the true story of Solomon was hidden from the Bible. But this, of course, it makes no sense at all, because these mystical stories about Solomon came a long time after the biblical text of the Old Testament was written. As for archaeology, most archaeologists agree on Solomon's historicity, although there is much debate about the extent and characteristics of his kingdom. But recent archaeological findings have increasingly contributed to the understanding of the period of Israeli monarchy. Although excavations in the area where the temple was, and perhaps the most important for possible discoveries of Solomon's time, are always very problematic for political and religious reasons. Therefore, what we really know reliably about who Solomon was is what is recorded in the Bible. And most importantly in all this is to understand that all the glory and splendor of the kingdom of Solomon only typified the eternal kingdom of the Messiah, so that Psalm 72, attributed to Solomon, makes use of a hyperbolic language to, at the same time, refer to the human king, and pronounce the divine king, who is Christodine king, who is Christ.
We're wrapping up today's video, but what was said might keep echoing in you. Comment where you're from, share what hit you hardest, and if you'd like, subscribe and share. That helps keep our channel alive. And of course, don't forget the description. There's always more that can expand what you saw here today. Thank you, a big hug, and see you in the next one.